It wasn't mercy that saved her. It was the raw, screaming instinct of a man who had already watched a river steal everything he loved. When Cole Garrett dragged the Apache woman from the churning maw of the San Pedro River, he thought the debt was paid. He'd cheated death on her behalf. But in the silent, watchful eyes of her people who found them, he saw a terrifying truth. He hadn't just saved a life. He had claimed it. By a sacred ancient law, he could not comprehend the woman named Nita, daughter of a chief, now belonged to him. He was a man running from his own ghosts, seeking solitude, and now he was a reluctant master, a captor by honor, in a land that would kill them both for the bond they never asked for. The sky over the Arizona territory had been the color of a fresh bruise for 3 days straight. Cole Garrett, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-scorched trails and private sorrows, knew what it meant. The dry washes and creek beds, skeletal for months, were about to run with a biblical fury. He was checking his trap lines along the high banks of the San Pedro, his mind a quiet hum of familiar tasks, a defense against the louder memories that haunted his sleep. He'd built his cabin far from everything, nestled in a stand of cottonwoods that offered the only real shade for miles. He wanted nothing from the world but to be left alone with the ghosts of his wife, Sarah, and his boy, little Thomas, both taken by cholera 2 winters back. Their silence was the only company he could bear. The world of men, with its loud talk and hollow promises, held no appeal. Redemption, the nearest town, was a full day's ride, and he made the trip only when his salt and flour ran low. A low rumble felt more in the soles of his worn boots than Herd pulled him from his reverie. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of the earth moving, of water devouring land. He scrambled to the edge of the embankment and looked down. The San Pedro, usually a lazy silver ribbon, had become a monster. A churning, muddy behemoth, frothing with uprooted trees, dead livestock, and the debris of a world being washed away. A flash flood, the most treacherous and sudden killer in this unforgiving land. He was about to turn back to retreat to the safety of high ground when a flicker of color caught his eye amidst the brown chaos. Not the green of a tree or the gray of a boulder, but the deep indigo and red of a woman's dress snagged on the branches of a half-submerged mesquite tree. A figure was clinging to it, a desperate knot of humanity against the overwhelming power of the flood. His first instinct was brutal and self-preserving: turn away. Getting involved meant risking the only thing he had left, his own grim existence. This wasn't his fight. But then the figure's head turned, and for a split second, through the spray and the roar, he saw a face. Young, terrified. Apache. The sight struck him like a physical blow. He didn't see a savage, as the men in Redemption would call her. He saw a person about to be swallowed by the same indifferent nature that had taken his own family. A bitter, useless anger surged through him. He couldn't just stand by and watch it happen again. Cursing his own conscience, he sprinted along the bank, his eyes locked on the woman. He needed a better angle, a place where the current wasn't so ferocious. He spotted a place downstream where a massive rock outcrop split the current, creating a small, violent eddy, but also a chance. He coiled the lariat from his saddle, the leather familiar and steady in his trembling hands. The woman's grip was failing. The mesquite branch groaned, threatening to snap. He had one shot. He swung the rope, the loop, a perfect spinning circle against the grey sky, and let it fly. It fell short, slapped into the water, and was instantly whipped away. He recoiled it, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He could hear her scream now, a thin, desperate sound swallowed by the river's roar. He ran further, his lungs burning until he was almost parallel with her. He swung again, putting every ounce of his strength, his desperation, his rage at a cruel world into the throw. The loop sailed true. It dropped over her head and shoulders. He yanked it tight, the rope digging into his palms. The force of the current pulling on her nearly ripped his arms from their sockets. He dug his heels into the mud, his body a straining anchor against the river's might. "Hold on!" He roared, the words torn from his throat. She understood the intent, if not the language. She locked her arms around the rope, her small frame, a dead weight against the torrent. Cole leaned back, every muscle screaming in protest, the mud sucking at his boots. He was losing ground. The river was stronger. With a final desperate surge of adrenaline, he threw himself backward, wrapping the end of the rope around the base of a sturdy ironwood tree. The rope went taut, with a sound like a gunshot. The strain was immense, the rope vibrating with a deadly hum. For a moment, nothing happened. It was a standoff between a single man and a raging river with a life as the prize. Then slowly, agonizingly, he began to pull. Hand over hand, the wet rope tearing the skin from his palms, he hauled her from the main current and into the relative calm of the eddy behind the rock. She was still in the water, but she was out of the worst of it. Exhausted, she let go of the mesquite branch and clung only to the rope. Cole worked frantically, pulling her closer and closer to the bank. Finally, he was able to reach down, grab the sodden fabric of her dress, and with a grunt that felt like it tore something deep inside him, he hauled her onto the muddy bank. She lay there gasping, coughing up muddy water, her black hair plastered to her face. Her dress was torn, her skin scraped and bruised, but she was alive. Cole collapsed beside her, his chest heaving, his body spent. The roar of the river filled the silence between them. He had done it. He had stared into the void and pulled someone back. He didn't know how long they lay there, the rain starting to fall again, cold and hard. When he finally pushed himself up, he saw she was watching him. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and filled with a mixture of terror and utter confusion. She said nothing. Cole, a man unaccustomed to speaking, cleared his throat. You all right, miss?" She just stared. Of course she didn't understand him. He looked around. They were on his side of the river, but her people were likely on the other. There was no crossing this flood, not for days. He was stuck with her. As dusk began to settle, painting the violent water in shades of purple and grey, a new sound cut through the river's roar. The nicker of horses. Cole's head snapped up. On the ridge above them, silhouetted against the dying light, were 5 riders. They weren't cowboys. Their long hair, the shape of their bows, the way they sat their ponies with an effortless grace. They were Apache. Warriors. They had seen it all. They urged their horses down the slick embankment, their movements sure and silent. They surrounded Cole and the woman, their faces impassive, masks, their dark eyes missing nothing. Not Cole's rope, not his bleeding hands, not the exhausted woman at his feet. One of the warriors dismounted and helped the woman to her feet. He spoke to her in their low, guttural language. She replied softly, her gaze flicking from the warrior to Cole and back again. Cole slowly got to his feet, raising his hands to show he was unarmed and meant no harm. He expected suspicion, maybe even violence. He was a white man, alone with one of their women. In this part of the country, that was a death sentence. The lead warrior, a man with a hawk-like nose and scars on his cheek, dismounted and approached him. He didn't look at Cole with hatred. He looked at him with something far more unsettling, a deep, profound solemnity. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes moving from Cole to the woman, then to the raging river. He spoke not in Apache, but in broken, heavily accented English. "You pull her from water, spirit," he said, his voice a low gravel. It wasn't a question, Cole nodded, wary. She would have drowned. The warrior's gaze was intense, as if he were weighing Cole's very soul. He gestured to the woman who now stood straighter, her fear replaced by a stoic resignation that chilled Cole to the bone. "Her name is Nita," the warrior said, "daughter of Chief Goklia." He paused, letting the weight of the name settle in the humid air. "By the sacred law of the Chiricahua, the life you save from the spirit world is yours to keep. Its breath is now owed to you. You have saved her. She belongs to you now." Cole's mind went blank. The rain, the roaring river, the hard faces of the warriors. It all faded into a dull buzz. "Belongs to me," he repeated the words, tasting like ash. "What in God's name are you talking about? I just pulled her out of the water. That's all." The warrior whose name Cole would later learn was Ja remained impassive. "It is the law," he stated simply, as if explaining the rising of the sun. "You have intervened with her fate. Her spirit was on its way to the next world, and you called it back. Now it is tied to yours. The debt must be honored." Cole stared at Nita. She stood beside Ju, her face a mask of stone, but he could see a flicker of something in her dark eyes. Was it fear defiance? She wouldn't look at him. She was a chief's daughter, and now, according to these men, she was his property. The thought was so absurd, so monstrous, it almost made him laugh. "Listen," Cole said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I appreciate your customs, but I don't want anything. I don't want a debt. Just take her home. Take her back to her father. Tell him it was nothing." Ju's expression hardened. "It is not nothing," he countered, his voice losing its patient edge. "To save a life is the greatest of deeds. To then cast it aside is the greatest of insults. It would be like saving a man from thirst only to let him starve. It mocks the spirits. It brings dishonor to her father, and to you." A younger, more volatile warrior spurred his horse forward. His face was contorted with fury, his hand resting on the knife at his belt. Cole recognized him instantly as a rival, a man whose place had been usurped. This was Kyle. The white man plays games. Kyle spat in Apache, and though Cole didn't understand the words, the venom was universal. Ju silenced him with a sharp gesture. "You do not understand our ways," Ju said to Cole, his voice low and urgent. "You cannot refuse. If you refuse her, you are telling our people that a Chiricahua life is worthless to you. An insult my chief Goklia cannot ignore. It will be taken as an act of war." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. War. Cole Garrett, a man who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten, was now the potential spark for a bloody conflict. He had two choices, both impossible. He could accept this woman, this complete stranger from another world, into his solitary life, binding them both in a bizarre cultural contract he didn't believe in. Or he could refuse, and likely be killed where he stood, or worse, trigger raids and reprisals that would cost dozens of lives. He looked again at Nita. For the first time, she met his gaze directly. He saw the proud set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes. She wasn't a prize to be won or a burden to be shouldered. She was a woman trapped in a nightmare just as he was. Her fate was now inexplicably tangled with his. His shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him, replaced by a weary resignation. He had spent 2 years trying to avoid entanglements, and in a single act of decency he had become more entangled than he could ever have imagined. "All right," he said, the word heavy and sour. I accept." Ju nodded, a flicker of relief crossing his stoic face. He spoke to Nita in their tongue. Her posture didn't change, but a tear traced a clean path through the mud on her cheek before she swiftly wiped it away. She was being given to a stranger, an enemy of her people, and her only duty was to accept it with honor. "The river is too high," Ju said. "We cannot cross back. You will take her to your lodge. When the water falls, our chief Goklia will send for you. He will wish to see the man who holds his daughter's life." With that, the warriors turned their ponies. All except Kale. He stared at Cole, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost a physical force. He spat on the ground near Cole's feet before wheeling his horse around and following the others into the gathering darkness. And then they were gone. Cole was alone with a woman he didn't know, a woman who now belonged to him. The silence that descended was heavier and more awkward than any he had ever known. The only sound was the incessant roar of the river, the very force that had sealed their fates together. He gestured awkwardly toward the path leading to his cabin. "My home is this way." Nita gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She followed a few paces behind him, her movements graceful despite her exhaustion and soaked clothing. She walked like a princess forced into exile. The cabin was a simple, one-room affair, clean but stark. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a single cot and a few shelves, holding his meager possessions. For 2 years it had been his sanctuary. Tonight it felt like a cage. He lit a lantern, the yellow light pushing back the shadows. Nita stood by the door, dripping onto the floorboards, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked small and utterly out of place. Cole felt a pang of something, pity, guilt, frustration. He was as much her prisoner as she was his. He pointed to the fire. "I'll get a fire going. You should get out of those wet things." He had a spare blanket, thick wool that would have to do. He turned his back to give her privacy, busying himself at the hearth, his hands clumsy as he struck flint to steel. He was acutely aware of every rustle of fabric, every soft footstep behind him. When the fire was crackling, casting a warm glow over the room, he turned back. She had wrapped herself in the blanket, her wet dress lying in a heap on the floor. She was huddled by the fire, her back to him, her shoulders trembling slightly. Cole didn't know what to do. He couldn't offer comfort in a language she understood. He couldn't explain the absurdity of their situation. He was a trapper, not a diplomat. He did the only thing he could think of. He put a pot of water on to boil for coffee and cut a thick slice of bread from his last loaf, setting it on a plate with a piece of dried venison. He placed it on the floor beside her, not too close, and retreated to the far side of the room. He watched as she looked at the food, then at him, her expression unreadable. After a long moment, she picked up the jerky and began to eat slowly, methodically. He sat on his cot, the chasm between them, wider than the flooded river outside. He looked at this stranger, this chief's daughter, now his responsibility, by a law he couldn't fathom. He had saved her from the water only to see her drown in a sea of tradition and honor. And he was drowning right alongside her. The silence in the cabin was no longer peaceful. It was filled with the deafening weight of a life he now held in his hands. The days that followed were a suffocating blend of silence and tension. The San Pedro River remained a swollen, impassable barrier, isolating Cole's small cabin from the rest of the world and trapping him with his new charge. Nita was a silent, watchful presence. She moved with a quiet efficiency that made Cole feel like a clumsy oaf in his own home. He had given her the cot, choosing to sleep on a bedroll by the dying embers of the fire. It was a small gesture, but the only one he could think of to establish that he was not her master. But she seemed to interpret every action or inaction through the lens of her own culture. When he tried to cook his own meager breakfast, she would watch with an unnerving stillness as if his fumbling attempts were an affront to some natural order. On the third morning, he woke to the smell of something other than stale coffee and wood smoke. Nita was already awake, tending the fire. She had found his stash of cornmeal, and using a flat stone she'd heated in the embers was making small, thin cakes. She had also gathered herbs from just outside the cabin plants he'd walked past 1,000 times without a second glance, and brewed a fragrant, steaming tea. She offered him a cake and a cup of tea without a word, her expression neutral. The corn cake was delicious, far better than his usual fare. The tea was bitter, but warming. He ate in silence, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and resentment. Her competence was a constant reminder of how ill-equipped he was for this situation. She wasn't just surviving, she was creating order from his bachelor chaos. She cleaned the cabin with a quiet thoroughness, patched a tear in one of his shirts with a skill that was almost hypnotic to watch, and even tended to the cuts on his hands from the rope, applying a poultice of chewed leaves that soothed the burning pain instantly. She was not behaving like a slave or a prisoner. She was behaving as if this was now her domain, her responsibility. Her work was not done with subservience, but with a deep ingrained dignity. Cole tried to communicate. He would point to objects and say their names. Table, rifle, water. She would listen, her head tilted, and sometimes she would offer the Apache word in a soft, low voice. It was a slow, awkward process, two worlds colliding in a single cramped room. The most profound moment of connection came one evening. Cole was cleaning his rifle, the familiar mechanical task a comfort to him. He was distracted his mind on the past when he noticed Nita looking at the small, faded photograph he kept propped on the mantelpiece. It was the only picture he had of Sarah and Thomas, taken by a traveling photographer just a year before they died. Nita pointed to the picture, a question in her eyes. Cole's throat tightened. He rarely looked at it directly anymore. The pain was too sharp, but he felt compelled to answer her silent query. He picked it up his thumb, brushing over Sarah's smiling face. "My wife," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "Sarah." He then touched the image of the small boy holding his hand. "My son, Thomas." He didn't know if she understood the words, but he felt she understood the meaning. He added the one word that needed no translation. "Gone." Nita looked at the photograph, then at Cole's face. For the first time, he saw not a chief's daughter or a cultural pawn, but a woman capable of deep empathy. She reached out her fingers, hesitating for a moment, before lightly touching his forearm. It was a simple, fleeting gesture, but it conveyed more than 1,000 words. It was an acknowledgement of his loss, a shared understanding of grief that transcended language. In that moment, the space between them shrank just a little, but their fragile peace was an illusion. From the high ridges overlooking the cabin, they were being watched. Kyle, his heart, a cold knot of jealousy and rage, had not returned to his people. He tracked Cole and Nita, his mind a venomous swamp of perceived insults. He saw the white man who had stolen his intended bride, a woman he had courted for years, a woman whose hand would have secured his own status and power. He saw Nita not as a prisoner, but as a willing participant in her own dishonor, tending to the white man's home. Every shared meal, every small gesture of coexistence he witnessed through his stolen spyglass, twisted the knife of his hatred deeper. He couldn't challenge Cole directly. Jews' orders and the sacred law were clear for now. To harm Cole would be to harm Nita's owner, a complex taboo. But Kyle was not a man bound by the spirit of the law only by its letter. He began to formulate a plan to destroy the white man, not with an arrow, but with the white man's own brand of justice. One afternoon, while Cole was out checking the river level, Nita was stretching a deer hide he'd left to cure. Her senses, honed by a life in the wild, were far sharper than his. She caught a flicker of movement on the ridge, the glint of sun on metal. It was gone in an instant. A deer, a coyote, you know. The feeling it left behind was cold and sharp, the feeling of being watched by human eyes. When Cole returned, she tried to warn him. She pointed to the ridge, making a gesture of two eyes, her expression urgent. Cole scanned the rocky crest, but saw nothing. "It's nothing," he said, patting her shoulder reassuringly. "Probably just a mountain lion." But Nita knew better. She knew the stillness of a predator. And the predator on that ridge was not a lion. It was a man. And she knew in her bones that the fragile world she and Cole were building in that tiny cabin was about to be shattered. After a week, the San Pedro's fury subsided into a manageable, albeit still swift current. It was crossable now, but Cole knew a visit from Chief Goclea was imminent. His supplies were also perilously low. The cornmeal was gone, the coffee was dust, and the salt was a precious few crystals at the bottom of a sack. He had no choice but to ride to redemption. The thought of leaving Nita alone was unsettling. After her warning about the watcher on the ridge, a new unease had taken root in him. But the thought of bringing her into town was even worse. Redemption was a town built on hard rock and harder opinions. The locals, mostly miners and ranchers, viewed the Apache with a mixture of fear and contempt, fueled by years of brutal conflict. Bringing a young Apache woman into town, a woman who was living with him, was like carrying a lit torch into a powder magazine. He tried to explain his dilemma to her, using their patchwork vocabulary of single words and gestures. "Town," he said, pointing east. "Food. Supplies." Then he pointed at her, and then at the cabin, making a gesture of staying. Nita's response was firm. She shook her head, her jaw set. She picked up a small empty sack and held it out, then pointed to herself, and then to him, and then to the east. She was coming with him. Her expression made it clear that this was not a request. Whether it was because she feared being left alone, or because she felt it was her duty to accompany him, he didn't know. But he saw the futility in arguing. Perhaps it was safer to keep her with him after all. The ride to redemption was tense. Nita rode his spare mule, her back ramrod straight, her eyes constantly scanning the surrounding terrain. Cole felt the weight of 1,000 invisible stares. He had entered a world he did not understand, and now he was dragging her into a world that would never understand her. As they rode down Redemption's dusty main street, the town fell silent. Conversations on the boardwalks of the saloon and the general store died mid-sentence. Doors creaked open as people peered out. Every eye was on them. Cole felt the gazes like physical blows, the hostile glares of the men, the scandalized whispers of the few women. They weren't just looking at a white man and an Apache woman. They were looking at a traitor, a squaw man, the lowest of the low in the rigid hierarchy of the frontier. His first and only stop was Jebediah Pike's general store. Jeb was a crusty, barrel-chested man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He was as close to a friend as Cole had. Jeb's eyebrows shot up when Cole walked in, with Nita a step behind him, but he had the decency not to say anything immediately. He just nodded at Cole and went on weighing a sack of beans for another customer. When the store was empty, Jeb leaned on the counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. "Cole," he said, his voice a low rumble, "either you've lost your damn mind, or there's a story here that's going to cost one of us a bottle of whiskey." Cole, in as few words as possible, explained the flood, the rescue, and the Apache law. He left out the part about the watcher on the ridge. Jeb listened, his expression growing more grim with every word. He pushed his spectacles up on his forehead and sighed a long, weary sound. "So you're telling me you're stuck between an Apache chief and a hard place," he said. "Son, you haven't just stepped in it, you're swimming in it." He looked over at Nita, who was examining a bolt of blue calico cloth, her face impassive. "She's the daughter of Goklia, the big chief himself. Cole, this ain't just some tribal custom. This is politics, with knives." As Cole gathered his supplies, flour, salt, coffee, bacon, the door swung open, and Sheriff Bodine walked in. Sheriff Amos Bodine was a man who wore his authority like a well-oiled gun belt. He was tall, with a politician's smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He represented the law in redemption, but everyone knew the law he served best was his own self-interest. Bodine's eyes flickered from Cole to Nita, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Garrett," he said, his tone deceptively friendly. "Been a while. I see you've found yourself some company." "Sheriff," Cole replied, his voice flat. "Heard some commotion out your way. River washed out the Henderson crossing." Bodine continued walking closer. He stopped and looked Nita up and down with an appraising gaze that made Cole's hands clench into fists. "This one get washed up on your shore." "Something like that," Cole said, shouldering his sack of flour. "You want to be careful, Cole," Bodine said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "People around here are on edge. Old man Pierce lost 3 head of cattle last week, blaming it on Apache raiders from Goklia's band." He clapped a hand on Cole's shoulder. "Having one of them living under your roof, it doesn't look good. It looks like you're choosing a side, and I'd hate to see a good man like you end up on the wrong one." The threat was unmistakable, wrapped in a veneer of friendly advice. Bodine wasn't just a lawman, he was an agent of progress, which in this territory meant pushing the Apache off their ancestral lands, so men like Franklin Pierce, a wealthy and influential rancher, could expand their herds. Cole's strange arrangement with Nita was a complication Bodine hadn't counted on, and it was clear he saw it as an opportunity. Cole just nodded, paid Jeb for his supplies, and turned to leave. "Thanks for the advice, Sheriff." As they stepped back out into the harsh sunlight, the street was no longer empty. A small crowd had gathered. Franklin Pierce himself stood on the saloon boardwalk, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. Pierce was a big man running to fat with a florid face and an air of angry entitlement. "That him, Sheriff?" Pierce bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Cole. "That the man shacking up with one of the savages that's been stealing my livestock?" Bodine held up a calming hand, the very picture of reluctant authority. "Now, Franklin, let's not jump to conclusions. Cole Garrett is a citizen of this town." "He ain't acting like one," another man shouted from the crowd. "He's a traitor." Nita, who had been a silent observer, moved closer to Cole, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept tucked in her belt. Her eyes, no longer passive, scanned the hostile faces with a warrior's cool assessment. She understood nothing of their words, but she understood the language of hate perfectly. Cole put a hand on her arm, a silent signal to stay calm. He stared directly at Pierce, his own face a granite mask. "I haven't stolen anything from you, Pierce, and you've got no cause to speak about this lady." Pierce laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "Lady. That's a good one, Garrett. You bring that squaw back to the reservation where she belongs, or we'll do it for you." Sheriff Bodine stepped between them. "All right, that's enough. Go on home, Cole. Just think about what I said." Cole led the mule through the parting crowd, the insults and jeers following them like stones. As they rode out of town, he could feel Bodine's cold eyes on his back. He had gone to Redemption for supplies, but he had found something far more dangerous an enemy. Sheriff Bodine and Franklin Pierce had a plan for this land, and he and Nita were now standing squarely in their way. He had a sickening feeling that the rustled cattle were just the beginning. Bodine hadn't been offering a warning. He had been laying a trap. The ride back from Redemption was shrouded in a heavy silence. The ugliness of the town clung to Cole like trail dust, and the fragile peace he and Nita had built in the cabin was replaced by the grim reality of their shared predicament. They were no longer just two people caught in a cultural crossfire. They were allies in a war they hadn't chosen, with enemies on all sides. In town, Sheriff Bodine wasted no time. He met Franklin Pierce in the dusty back room of the Land Registrar's office, a place where crooked deals were the local currency. "Garrett's a problem," Pierce grumbled, pouring a whiskey. "Living with one of them makes them seem almost human. It's bad for business." "It's more than a problem, Franklin," Bodine replied, a predatory smile on his lips. "It's a gift. Right now, Garrett is just an outcast. But what if he's a renegade? A man who was thrown in with the Apache, helping them raid our herds?" Pierce's eyes lit up with greedy understanding. "If he's a renegade, his claim on that valley, on that spring, becomes invalid. And if we can prove Goclia's band is behind the raiding, then the territorial government will finally authorize my request for a militia," Bodine finished smoothly. "We can push the Apache out for good. Your cattle get more land, and I become the man who tamed the territory. All we need is proof." And Bodine knew just how to manufacture it. They were not the only ones plotting. From the high ridges, Cale, the spurned Apache warrior, watched the cabin with a heart full of venom. He saw Cole and Nita as partners in dishonor. Driven by a desperate need for revenge, he formulated his own plan, a clever, cruel scheme he believed would disgrace Cole and force Nita's return to her people. Under the sliver of a new moon, Cale moved like a ghost. He slipped down to the edge of Pierce's vast ranch and expertly cut 2 prime steers from the herd. But instead of driving them toward the Apache reservation, he drove them north. As he passed the valley holding Cole's cabin, he guided the cattle through a narrow wash less than a mile from the property, leaving a clear trail. As a final damning touch, he fired one of his clan's distinctive arrows into the dirt nearby. He was certain the white men would blame Cole and his savage bride, forcing the tribe to intervene. Kyle never imagined he was the perfect, unwitting pawn in Sheriff Bodine's far more dangerous game. The next morning, Pierce discovered his loss and stormed into Redemption, playing the part of the outraged victim for the whole town to see. "They did it again, Bodine," he roared. "2 more steers, my boys found a trail, and it leads right up toward that renegade Garrett's land." Bodine, feigning reluctance, gathered a posse of 12 deputized men, mostly Pierce's ranch hands, spoiling for a fight. They were not a party of inquiry. They were a lynch mob with a license. "We'll ride out and have a look," Bodine announced to the eager crowd, "just to question Mr. Garrett and see what he knows." Back at the cabin, Nita was outside when she suddenly froze, her head lifted like a deer sensing a wolf on the wind. She dropped her firewood and ran inside, her eyes wide with alarm. She grabbed Cole's arm, pointing urgently out the door. "Men!" she said, one of the few English words she knew. "Horses. Many." Cole rushed to the door and listened. He heard it, then the faint, rhythmic drumming of many hooves growing steadily louder. A cloud of dust crested the nearby hill, resolving into 12 armed riders moving at speed. This was not a visit. This was an attack. "We have to go. Now!" Cole said, his voice tight with urgency. There was no time to think. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition, while Nita snatched a water skin. They scrambled out the back of the cabin and into the woods, climbing the rocky slope behind it, just as the posse thundered into the clearing. They took cover behind a rock outcropping, listening as Bodine's voice echoed below. "He's flown the Coupe C. He's guilty," Bodine shouted. "Spread out and find them. Pierce is offering $100 for Garrett, dead or alive." The words hit them like a physical blow. They were no longer just outcasts. They were fugitives with a price on their heads. The wilderness that had been Cole's sanctuary was now a hostile maze. He and Nita fled into the jagged, sun-blasted canyons to the West Apache territory, their only refuge. Bodine's posse, filled with men who knew the main trails would be hunting them with the grim certainty of wolves. Their one advantage was that they were on foot, able to go where horses could not follow. And it was here, in the heart of her own unforgiving land, that the dynamic between them irrevocably shifted. In the cabin, he was the reluctant host. In town, the defiant protector. But out here, she was the master. Cole was a capable survivor, but Nita was a part of the landscape. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, reading the terrain in a language he had never learned. She found game trails invisible to his eyes, paths that wound through thorn-choked ravines, and up sheer rock faces where no posse would think to look. He was the stranger now, completely dependent on her knowledge. For 2 days, they moved a desperate, silent partnership, fueled by dwindling water and the ever-present threat of discovery. The sounds of the posse were a distant but constant menace, a dislodged rock, a far-off shout, carried on the wind, reminding them they were prey. They slept in short, fitful bursts, huddled in the shallow overhang of a cliff, taking turns on watch. During a brief rest in the oppressive heat, Nita insisted on tending to a deep gash on Cole's leg from a slip on a scree slope. She created a poultice from chewed leaves, her touch gentle but firm as she applied it to the wound. As she worked, Cole watched her face, seeing the intense focus, the complete absence of panic. She was afraid he knew, but her fear was a tool sharpening her senses rather than paralyzing them. He thought of his wife, Sarah, a woman of immense inner strength, but one whose grace belonged to a world of hearth and home. Out here she would have perished. Nita, however, was forged from the very rock and sun they were hiding in. A profound respect, deeper and more potent than any he had felt since his wife's death, began to take root in his soul. On the 3rd day, their canteens ran dry. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the red rock and turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Cole's head pounded his thoughts, growing fuzzy with dehydration. The world began to tilt and sway, and he stumbled, his wounded leg giving way. Nita caught his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, her brow furrowed with concern as she looked at his face. She placed a hand on the hot canyon wall, looked up at the sun and sniffed the air, reading signs in the world that were invisible to him. Without a word, she tugged his arm, leading him not forward, but down into a narrow, winding slot canyon that seemed a certain dead end. The stone walls closed in the air, growing blessedly cooler. "Where are we going?" he rasped, his voice a dry crackle. She pressed on her certainty, unwavering. After 100 yards of twisting passage, the canyon opened into a small hidden basin, no bigger than his cabin. A patch of vibrant green ferns clung to the rock wall, and from a dark fissure, a tiny crystal-clear trickle of water seeped out, collecting in a shallow stone bowl. It was a seep spring, a secret gift of the desert. Cole fell to his knees, plunging his face into the cool water, the relief so intense it was painful. He drank greedily, feeling life seep back into him. Nita drank as well, but with a measured restraint, her eyes still scanning the canyon rim above them. She had not just found water. She had saved his life. The realization struck Cole with the force of a physical blow. He had pulled her from the river, but she had just led him from a slower, more agonizing death. A life for a life. The law of her people, which had seemed so alien now, made a profound, terrible sense. The debt was now his. Their reprieve was shattered by a sharp whistle from the canyon rim. It was not a bird. It was a human signal. They looked up to see two men from the posse silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky. They had been spotted. "Down here!" One of them yelled, his voice echoing in the basin. "I've found them!" Gunshots erupted. Bullets sparked against the rock near their heads, whining and ricocheting in the enclosed space. There was no escape. The sheer walls of the basin that had been their salvation were now their tomb. Cole shoved Nita behind the stone basin, raised his rifle and fired back the shot, a deafening thunderclap. He wasn't aiming to kill, but to keep their heads down, to buy them a few precious seconds. More men were appearing on the rim. They were hopelessly outnumbered. Just as Cole levered another round into the chamber, a new sound split the air, a high, terrifying war cry from further down the canyon. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, hissed through the air and buried itself in the chest of a man on the rim. He screamed once and tumbled from view. Another arrow followed, then another. From the rocks above and behind the posse, Apache warriors seemed to materialize from the stone itself. It was Ju the warrior who had first delivered Nita to him, his face now painted for battle. With him were a half-dozen others moving with deadly purpose. The posse caught completely by surprise, between Cole's rifle below and the warrior's arrows above, descended into chaos. The organized hunt became a frantic scramble for survival. The brief, brutal firefight was a blur of smoke yells and the chilling hiss of arrows. The ranchers were no match for the Apache on their own ground. Within minutes, the survivors fled their horses' panicked gallops, fading into the distance. Silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the harsh sound of Cole's breathing. Ju and his warriors slid down the rock face into the basin. Ju approached his face, a grim mask. He glanced at the dead man on the rim, then at Nita, who stood with palpable relief. "Our scout saw the white men's tracks," Ju said to Cole, his voice hard. "We knew they were hunting you. You have led them deep into our lands." "They were trying to kill us," Cole answered, lowering his rifle. "They think I'm helping you raid their cattle." Ju's eyes narrowed with contempt. The cattle stolen from the fat rancher, that was Kyle's work. Alone, he sought to bring you dishonor, leaving a trail a blind child could follow, pointing to your lodge. The pieces crashed into place for Cole. Bodine's manufactured rage, the posse, it had all been a trap, and Kyle's jealous, foolish act had sprung it. "Kyle's actions have endangered the daughter of our chief," Yu said, his voice dropping to a cold, dangerous tone. "He has brought enemies into our sacred canyons and shamed our people. He will answer to Goklia." Ju turned his hard gaze back to Cole. "And so will you. Goklia has sent for us. He will hear this whole story, and he will pass his judgment." The journey to Chief Goklia's encampment was a tense, silent affair. They rode into a hidden mountain valley, a bustling village of wickiups and cooking fires that fell quiet at their approach. Every eye was on the white man riding beside the chief's daughter. They were led to the center of the camp where an old man sat waiting. His face was a map of wisdom and time, his eyes dark and piercing. Despite his age, he radiated immense power. This was Chief Goklia. Nita approached her father, bowing her head. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening for a moment, before his gaze settled on Cole, becoming an unreadable mask of authority. Yu stepped forward and recounted the events, his words painting a clear picture for his chief, the rescue, the sacred law, the treachery of Kale, and the fight in the canyon. As he spoke, abound and defiant, Kale was brought before them, his face a storm of fury and shame. When Yu finished, Goklia was silent. At last his gaze fell upon Kale. Taza, the tribe's elder, stood beside Cole to translate the chief's judgment. "You let jealousy poison your heart," Taza conveyed. "You used the white man's foolishness to bring shame upon a daughter of our people and danger to our lands. You have followed the path of the snake, not the warrior. You are no longer one of us. Go! Walk the desert alone." Warriors cut Kale's bonds and shoved him from the camp. He cast one last hate-filled glance at Cole and Nita, then walked away, a man stripped of his world. Then Goklia's formidable gaze settled on Cole. "The white man, Cole Garrett," he began, his voice carrying an ancient weight. "You have the eyes of a man who has known great loss. You did not seek this burden. You acted from your heart. But the law is the law. A life was saved. A debt was created." Cole's throat went dry. The chief continued, "But our laws are not chains of iron like the white man's. They are living things like a river. They can bend. The law states that her life belongs to you to ensure a life saved is cherished, not discarded. It is a bond of spirit, not a brand of ownership." Goklia looked from Cole to his daughter. "I see how you look at her," he said through Taza. "Not as property. I see how she stands beside you. Not as a slave. The law has been fulfilled in spirit. You have protected her. You have honored the life you saved." The chief rose to his feet. "The debt is paid," he declared. "Nita's life is her own again. You, Cole Garrett, are free to return to your world. There is no more debt between us." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled Cole's knees, washed over him. He was free. He could return to his solitary life, to his ghosts. He could finally be alone again. He looked at Nita, expecting to share in this relief. But he saw only a profound sadness in her eyes, a look of loss that mirrored a sudden, devastating realization in his own heart. The thought of his empty cabin of a silence, no longer filled by her quiet presence, was unbearable. The solitude he had craved now felt like a desolate prison. Before he could process this, Nita turned to her father. She spoke, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a confidence Cole had never heard. Taza, a look of admiration on his old face, turned to Cole. "She says the chief is wise and the law is satisfied," he translated. "But her heart is not. She says her spirit was tied to yours by the river, and your journey has forged that tie into something the law cannot break. She has chosen her own path." Taza paused, a small smile touching his lips. "And it leads back to your cabin?" Stunned silence fell over the camp. Goklia held his daughter's gaze, seeing not a girl, but a woman who knew her own soul. A slow smile touched his lips as he looked at Cole, a silent question in his eyes. Cole Garrett, the man who wanted only to be left alone, looked at the Apache woman who had turned his world upside down. He knew with absolute certainty that he never wanted to be alone again. He met the chief's gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the answer anyone needed. They were no longer bound by law or custom. They were partners, and they were going home. What began as a desperate rescue from a raging river became a journey across the most treacherous landscapes of all the canyons of the human heart. Cole and Nita, a man haunted by his past, and a woman bound by ancient tradition, discovered that the laws that truly matter are not written on stone or scrolls, but are forged in shared struggle, mutual respect, and unspoken understanding. Their story isn't just about survival in the Wild West. It's a testament to the fact that two people from entirely different worlds can find a common language in honor, courage, and eventually love. They chose not to be defined by the laws of their people, but by the commitment they made to each other, creating a new life in a land that was hostile to them both. If this story of an unlikely bond and the fight for a life of one's own choosing resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who loves epic Western dramas, and most importantly, subscribe for more tales from the untamed frontier. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.